Montana Territory, April 1883, the wind howled low across the plains as Sutton Thorne spotted the figure slumped beside the creek, half hidden behind a thicket of willows. It was near dusk, and the cold was settling in fast. He dismounted without a word, boots crunching the frost-laced grass, and stepped closer. The figure stirred a woman, wrapped in what used to be a fine wedding dress, now torn and caked in mud. She looked up fast, startled. Her eyes were glassy but clear, her lips blue from cold. "Please," she whispered, voice rough. "I am not going back," Sutton frowned. "I am not here to take you anywhere, miss. I just do not like seeing folks die out here." The woman's name was Tallie Rosewood. She was 23 and had run all the way from a church in Helena, still wearing the dress she was meant to be married in. Her hands were scratched up from the brush, and her shoes, if you could call them that anymore, were falling apart. Her story came out in pieces as Sutton helped her onto his horse and rode double back to his ranch. No lies, no excuses, just the plain truth. She had run from a man twice her age, a man with money who had bought her father's debts. Sutton had not planned on any company, let alone a bride on the run. He had buried his wife 5 years ago and raised their 2 children alone since. Zadie was 10 now, strong-willed and sharp-eyed. Zeke was 7 and did not speak much since their mother passed, but he followed Sutton everywhere like a silent shadow. He had not brought a woman home since. But when Zadie saw Tallie shivering by the stove that night, she rushed to bring her a wool blanket. Zeke handed her a tin cup of warm milk without a word. Sutton leaned against the doorway and watched. Something about the way Tallie thanked them gentle, with a softness that did not beg, sat strangely in his chest. By the next morning, Tallie had cleaned up and changed into one of Sutton's late wife's old dresses. It hung loose on her frame, but she moved about the kitchen with quiet purpose, helping Zadie make cornbread and gently coaxing Zeke to eat more than a few bites. Sutton saddled his horse and rode out to check the south fence line, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the house. He told himself it was just worry. Nothing more. That night, Tallie sat beside the fire and stitched one of Zadie's torn sleeves. She did not ask for anything. She never asked. She only offered a hand when it was needed and stayed quiet when it was not. "You can stay a few days," Sutton finally said, his voice low, "until you figure out where you are headed." Tallie looked up, and for a moment her eyes met his. "Thank you," she said simply. "I do not have anywhere safe." Safe. That word twisted something deep inside him. By the end of the week, it was like she had always been there. She was gentle with the children, never overstepping. She respected the memory of his late wife, speaking her name only when Zadie brought her up and listening with care. There was no rush between them, no foolish talk, just quiet understanding. One morning, Sutton found her in the barn, kneeling beside a sick calf with a cloth in one hand and a bucket of warm water in the other. "You know cattle?" he asked, surprised. "My uncle raised them," she said, dabbing at the calf's nose. "I spent more time in the barn than the parlor." He crouched beside her, watching her movements. "You are full of surprises." "I had to be," she said, not looking up. "The world is not kind to women who are not." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Sutton found her out on the porch. She stared up at the stars, arms wrapped around herself. "Cold?" he asked. "No," she said softly, "just breathing." He stood beside her, close enough to feel her warmth. "You are safe here," she turned to him. "I know." The next morning, Sutton rode into town for supplies. When he returned, Tallie was in the field, helping Zadie and Zeke herd the sheep in before the storm clouds rolled over the hills. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth, and she looked like she had belonged here all along. But that night, as Sutton went through the week's mail, he found a notice from the bank. A final warning. Payments were overdue. If he could not pay off the remaining debt by the end of the month, the land would be taken. He sat at the kitchen table long after the fire died down, the letter in his hand, his jaw tight. He had not told Tallie. He had not told anyone. 3 days later, a man rode up to the ranch. His name was Miles Keating, and he wore a polished coat and a cruel smile. He looked at Tallie like she was property. "You cost me $5,000 walking out that church," he said. "You think you can hide in some dirt patch and I would not find you?" Sutton stepped in front of her, jaw sharp. "You need to leave. She is mine. She is not." Miles looked at Sutton, then at the children watching from the porch. "You really think you can keep her safe? You are nothing but a broke widower with a ranch on the edge of foreclosure." Tallie stepped forward, her voice steady. "You do not own me. You never did." Miles sneered, then turned his horse. "You have until the end of the month, Cowboy, then we will see how long your little family holds together." After he was gone, Sutton turned to her. "Why did he say that about the ranch?" Tallie hesitated. "Because my grandfather owned this land once, before the bank took it. Before Keating bought up everything he could, I ran because marrying him would have finished what he started, claiming the last piece." Sutton stared at her. "You are saying you are connected to this land? My grandfather was Thomas Rosewood. This was his ranch before it was yours." Sutton blinked. That name was on the deed, the original one he had seen when he first bought the land. He had never known. "I did not come here to take it back," she said quickly. "I just needed somewhere to start over." Sutton looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years something in him cracked open, not from grief but from hope. "You are not taking anything," he said. "You are saving it." And in that moment he realized something else. He wanted her to stay, not out of gratitude, not out of need, but because he was falling for her and he did not want to stop. The wind had shifted warmer by mid-May, and the cottonwoods along the creek were leafing out in green gold clusters. Calving was nearly over, and the fence repair along the north ridge had taken most of Sutton's daylight hours. Still, he rose early, worked steady, and came in late with the same quiet rhythm he always had. What changed was where his eyes landed when he came through the door. Tallie had carved a place for herself without asking. She'd started keeping a small garden behind the barn, coaxing peas and onions from the thawed soil. Zadie followed her out there some mornings, asking about roots and watering times. Zeke, quieter than ever, had taken to sitting near Tallie when she read aloud from the old Bible, not asking questions, but not wandering off either. One afternoon, after the branding was done for the season, Sutton found himself standing in the doorway of the lean-to she'd turned into a drying room. Herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, and rows of jars lined the shelf she'd built from scrap wood. "You planning on opening an apothecary?" he asked, leaning against the frame. She didn't glance up from the jar she was sealing. "I'd settle for keeping the fevers down come winter." He stepped inside, ducking under the hanging sprigs. "You learned this from your uncle too?" "No," she said, tying a strip of linen around the jar's mouth. "From my mother. She passed when I was 12, but she taught me what she could before." Sutton nodded, studying the neat rows. "You've been through more than you let on." "So have you," she said, and he didn't argue. Later that week, he rode into Fort Benton to meet with a man who owed him for 2 steers he'd sold last fall. The man was gone, moved east, said the clerk at the mercantile, left no forwarding. Sutton returned home with half the supplies he planned for and a hollowness behind his ribs that hadn't been there that morning. That night, as he poured a thin bit of coffee into his tin mug, Tallie moved beside him, silent for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking," she said, eyes on the fire. "There's a lawyer in Helena. He handled my grandfather's estate after the bank took over. If we could get the original deed, the one with the mineral rights noted, it might prove the Rosewood claim was never fully extinguished." Sutton looked at her. "You think there's silver or copper on this land?" "I think Keating believes there might be," she said. "It's the only reason he's pressing so hard." He took a long breath. "And you think we could challenge his hold on the debt?" Her voice was steady. "If the land was taken under false pretense, the note he's holding would be worthless." Sutton looked down at the mug in his hands. The firelight caught the lines in his face, deepened by years of weather and work. "I don't trust lawyers," he said. "I don't either," she replied, "but I trust what my grandfather wrote and what he built here." He felt the weight of her words settle deep. She wasn't offering rescue. She was offering to stand beside him as he fought. By the following morning, plans had taken shape. Sutton would ride into Helena in 2 days' time. Tallie would stay behind with the children. He didn't say it aloud, but he didn't want her anywhere near Keating's reach. Not again. As he packed his saddlebag, Zadie hovered nearby, clutching a small book wrapped in cloth. "For if you get bored," she said, placing it in his hand. He smiled, rare and quiet. "You think I'll have time for reading?" she shrugged. "Mama used to say you always made time for the things that matter." He swallowed hard, ruffled her hair, and turned to Tallie, who stood by the barn door, arms crossed against the morning chill. "If something happens," he began. "Nothing will," she interrupted, stepping closer. "But if it does, we'll hold fast." He nodded once, then climbed into the saddle. She didn't wave as he rode out. She just watched him until he was over the ridge and gone. The trip to Helena took 2 days. The road was rutted from spring runoff and the rivers ran high. Sutton kept to himself, staying in a boarding house above a bakery that smelled of yeast and wood smoke. The lawyer, a thin man named Corbin with ink-stained fingers, remembered the Rosewood case. "Unusual situation," he said, sifting through yellowed pages. The bank foreclosed, but the mineral rights weren't included in the sale. That clause was set to expire within 20 years unless the land passed through family hands again. Sutton leaned forward. "And if it's back in the hands of a Rosewood now?" Corbin looked up, surprised. "Then the rights revert." Outside, the wind cracked against the windows, and Sutton felt something shift in his chest, not relief, not quite, but the first breath of something like it. When he returned 3 days later, the ranch looked the same, but he saw it different. He found Tallie in the barn loft, mending a lamp chimney with wire. He climbed the ladder, held out the folded deed, and said, "We've got something now." She took it, eyes scanning the page, and when she looked up, she didn't smile. She just let out a long breath and touched his hand with hers. "I never thought I'd see this again." "You brought it home," he said. She didn't let go of his hand, and neither did he. In the quiet loft with the smell of hay and lantern smoke around them, something passed between them that didn't need words. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But he didn't step back either. Down below, Zeke called for supper, and the moment passed like a soft wind through dry grass. But it had come, and they both knew it. A slow rain had settled in by morning, laying down a hush across the prairie. The kind of rain that softened the dirt to loam and made the world smell like earth and green things trying to live. Sutton stood at the porch rail, hands wrapped firm around a tin cup gone cold, watching the horizon blur to gray. Behind him, the door creaked open. "I found your ledger," Tallie said, stepping out, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. It was tucked behind the flour sack. He didn't turn. "Been avoiding it?" "I figured," she said, quiet, "but I looked anyway." He set the cup down slow. "And you've stretched every cent as far as it'll go, but it won't last past summer." Rain tapped the porch roof like fingers drumming a table. He looked out toward the barn, where Zeke had tied 2 tin pans to the fence to catch drops, his small shape hunched with focus. "I've been thinking about the north pasture," she said. "The land's flat and close to water. If we put in rows, start with hardy seed barley, maybe we could trade with the fort this fall." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "It's grazing ground." "It still could be," she said. "But a piece of it could feed the rest." Sutton finally turned to face her. Her hair was damp at the edges, and her dress hem was dark with rain. "You want to farm it, I want to keep it," she said. "And I know how to drive a mule, you've got two." He studied her a long moment. "You offering to stay on permanent," she met his eyes. "If you'd have me." He stepped off the porch, boots sinking slightly in the wet earth, and looked back up at her. "I was hoping you'd say that." Later in the barn, Zadie helped Sutton mend a cracked yoke while Tallie sorted seed sacks in the back stall. The girl was quiet, brow furrowed, hands stained with oil. "She's not like Ma," Zadie said, not looking up. "No," Sutton answered, tying off a strap. "She's not. But she watches Zeke when he doesn't know it, and she listens when I talk." He paused, set down the pliers. That bother you? Zadie shrugged. No, it feels lighter when she's around. Sutton nodded once. Feels that way to me too. The next morning, Tallie rose before the sun. She stood at the edge of the north pasture with a shovel and a length of rope, measuring out rows by lantern light. By the time Sutton joined her, she'd marked out 4 furrows and laid stones at each corner. You don't wait on anyone, he said, taking the shovel from her hand. There's never been much time to, she replied. They worked side by side until the sun rose and the earth steamed beneath it. When they paused, she handed him a canteen. My father wasn't cruel, she said, eyes scanning the tree line. Just afraid. When the bank came for the house, he couldn't look me in the eye. Sutton drank, then passed it back. You still ran, even knowing he meant to make it right by marrying you off. I figured saving myself was the only thing I could do for us both. He adjusted his grip on the shovel. Did you think about where you were headed when you left? Only that I needed somewhere nobody would claim me, he looked at her then. You're not claimed here, you're chosen. She held his gaze a moment, then turned back to the row. Then let's make this land remember why it mattered. By midweek, the first signs of growth sprouted in the garden behind the barn. Zeke pointed them out without a word, tugging gently on Tallie's sleeve and leading her to the small green shoots pushing through the soil. She knelt beside him, muddying her skirt, and traced the leaves with one finger. Good eyes, she said. He nodded once, then walked back toward the house, pausing only to look over his shoulder. Tallie stood, brushing her hands on her apron, and caught Sutton watching from the porch. You've got strong roots here, she said when she reached him. A lot of things try to grow, not all of them take. She looked up at him, expression unreadable. Maybe this time they will. That evening after supper, Zadie pulled out a deck of cards and dealt them onto the table. Mama taught me how to play rummy. You want to learn? She asked Tallie. I'd like that, Tallie said, folding her hands on the table. Sutton watched them from his chair near the fire, the low murmur of their voices weaving with the crackle of flame. Zeke leaned against his side, head tucked under his arm, and for the first time in a long stretch, Sutton's chest didn't ache with the weight of what was gone. It filled instead with what had quietly grown in its place. Later, after the children had gone to their beds, Tallie lingered by the hearth, running her fingers along a wooden carving Zeke had left on the mantel, a rough horse, its legs uneven but standing. He whittled that for you, Sutton said from behind her. She turned the figure in her hand. He didn't say. He doesn't need to. She placed it gently back on the mantel, then turned toward him. You ever think you'd get another chance? He stepped closer, the firelight catching the edge of his jaw. Didn't think I'd want one. And now, he reached for her hand, calloused fingers brushing across her knuckles. Now I think I'd be a fool not to take it. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She just leaned into him, forehead resting against his collarbone, and he wrapped his arms around her like he'd been waiting years to do it. Outside, the rain had passed, and the sky cleared to a pale scatter of stars. The land lay quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after long hurt and hard-won peace. Inside, the fire burned low, and 2 people stood at its edge together at last. The first barley shoots broke through the soil under a pale morning sky, each one thin as a blade but steady in its reach. Sutton crouched beside the row, pressing 2 fingers to the dirt. Damp but not drowned. If the weather held, they might yet have a yield come late summer. Behind him, the barn doors groaned open. Tallie stepped out with a pail in one hand, her sleeves already rolled high. She didn't speak until she was beside him, the faint clink of water sloshing against the pail. You were up before the rooster, she said, setting it down. I heard the coyotes last night, Sutton replied. Didn't want to lose another lamb, she nodded. I didn't hear them. You were sleeping hard, he said. That's good. I dreamed I was back in my grandfather's house, she murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The kitchen smelled like sage and boiled coffee. I was kneeling on the floor, helping him sort seed by candlelight. Sutton stood, brushing the dirt from his palms. You miss him. Not the man he became, she said. But the one he was before the bank notices started piling up. He used to sing to me when we shelled beans. He watched her tilt the pail toward a row, pouring slow so the water followed the roots. You still remember the tune, she shook her head, not the words. Just the shape of it. By the time they finished watering, Zadie had come out with a basket of eggs and a question on her tongue. Can I take the pony to the creek today? She asked, already brushing down her dress. Not alone, Sutton said. But I'll come once we finish mending that south gate. I can go with her, Tallie offered. Sutton hesitated. He needs his shoe reset. You know how to brace him? I've done it, she said. Long time ago, but I remember. He studied her a moment, then nodded. All right. But stay near the trail. Zadie whooped, rushing off before either of them could change their mind. When they returned later that day, Zadie flushed from sun and Tallie with a streak of mud down one arm. Sutton had a visitor waiting near the porch. A man in a brown coat and scuffed boots, his hat pulled low. Sutton recognized him as one of Keating's hired men, the one who rarely spoke and always kept his hand near the butt of his revolver. Message, the man said, offering a sealed envelope. I don't take paper from men who won't say who sent it, Sutton said, stepping between him and the door. He said you'd want to read it. Sutton didn't move. He's wrong. The man looked past him, eyes landing on Tallie, then nodded once and turned to leave. Sutton waited until he was gone before tearing open the seal. The letter inside was written in a hand too practiced to be honest. I'm making my move. You can hold your dirt and your pride, but both will be worthless by month's end. Tallie took the page from his hand, reading it once. He's bluffing, she said. No, Sutton said. He's warning us. That night he went through the ledger again, this time with Tallie beside him. She traced a line with her finger. If we sell the 2-year-old steers to the army post, we can buy seed for fall. But it won't cover the blacksmith's bill or the wagon repairs. I can fix the wagon, Sutton said, and I can handle the smith work, Tallie said. The forge at the edge of town, the owner's wife used to buy preserves from my mother. I'll speak to her. Sutton looked at her. You sure? She glanced toward the children's room. If Keating's coming, we need to stand taller than him, not just try to hold ground. He reached across the table, took her hand. It's not just the land anymore. She didn't pull away. I know. The next few days passed in a rhythm unlike any before. Tallie spent mornings lining shelves in the root cellar, planning for a harvest they hadn't yet seen. Sutton rode out to the edge of the north ridge, marking where the cattle could graze without trampling the new barley rows. Zadie learned to sew a straight stitch under Tallie's watch, her hands less clumsy each day. And Zeke, without prompting, brought Tallie a bundle of dry kindling before supper, setting it by the stove without a word, then sitting down to shell peas. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Sutton and Tallie stood behind the barn, watching storm clouds build far off over the distant hills. When this is over, he said, voice low, I'd like to take you to the Rosewood Grove. The one by the creek near where your grandfather's house once stood. She looked up at him. It's still there, just the stones and the wild lilac, but it's quiet, feels like something remembered. She stepped closer. Then I'd like to see it. He reached for her hand again. This time she laced her fingers through his. I never thought I'd have this, he said, staring out over the twilight fields. Not again. You didn't get it back, she said. You made it new. He turned to face her. You helped me build it. She leaned in, slow and sure, and he met her halfway. When their lips touched, it was soft, unhurried, like the land itself had paused to listen behind them. Lightning flickered in the distance, silent and far away. But here, there was only the stillness that followed something deeply right falling into place. Neither spoke as they walked back toward the house. They didn't need to. Inside, the children's laughter echoed faintly down the hallway and the smell of cornbread lingered in the air. The storm would come, but they would face it together. The wind came hard from the west that Friday, bending the wheatgrass and rattling the eaves. Sutton stood by the open barn stall, brushing the dust off the bridle straps while Tallie checked the mule's hooves beside him. The barley rows had held fast through the week's rains, but the air carried that dry tension that came before a reckoning. Zeke came to the barn with a letter folded unevenly in his hand. "From the post," he said softly. Sutton wiped his hands on his trousers before taking it. The seal was plain, none of Keating's threats this time. Inside, the message was brief. The fort would accept the cattle trade, but they wanted delivery by week's end, and they couldn't offer coin, only provisions and credit on their ledgers. Sutton passed it to Tallie. "It's not what I hoped," she read it once. "But it'll cover what we need to finish planting and patch the cabin roof before fall," he nodded. "You think it's enough to hold Keating off?" "No," she said, folding the paper, "but it's enough to make him blink." They moved quickly. By the next morning, Sutton and Zadie had driven the steers to the trailhead, and Tallie spent the day cutting strips of cloth for seed markers while Zeke helped her line the garden beds. She tied a scrap of her old wedding dress to the fence post nearest the field, the fabric worn to softness but still white, like a small flag raised for something worth keeping. On the fourth morning, Keating rode in. He didn't bother hiding behind a hired man this time. His coat was dusted from travel, and his boots wore the sharp polish of someone who never walked further than the length of a parlor floor. Sutton met him in the yard, Tallie behind him with one hand resting on the porch rail. Zadie stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and Zeke stayed in the shadow of the house, quiet as always but watching. "I came to settle," Keating said, glancing past Sutton to the barley rows. "Looks like you've been busy." "We've made enough to stay," Sutton said. "And we've got the mineral rights to prove it." Keating's mouth twitched, but his eyes stayed cold. "That claim won't hold up without a court ruling, and you don't have the money for that." Tallie stepped down from the porch. "You're right, but I do." He narrowed his eyes. "You've got nothing." "My grandfather left me a chest of bond notes, hidden beneath the floorboards at the old grove. I dug them up last week." Keating's jaw stiffened. "You're bluffing." She held out a folded paper, the seal still intact. "This is a certified appraisal from the bank in Fort Benton. The notes are legitimate." He didn't take it, just stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You tried to own me," she said, voice steady, "but I don't belong to anyone. I built this life. I chose this family. And I'll fight for it." Sutton stepped closer. "You do well to ride out now. You've lost." Keating looked at the children, then at the house, then at the land that had grown green under hands that loved it. He didn't speak, just turned his horse and rode off into the dust. When he was gone, Tallie let out a breath that shook only a little. Sutton reached for her hand, and she didn't hesitate. Zadie came down the steps and stood beside them, Zeke at her side. Sutton looked at Tallie. "You really found the bonds?" She smiled, faint but sure. "No. But I knew he wouldn't press the law once he thought I could." Zadie blinked. "You lied." "I protected us," Tallie said, kneeling to look Zadie in the eye. "Sometimes the truth needs armor." Sutton laughed, quiet and full. "You would have made a fine general." "I'll settle for farmer," she said, standing. "As long as I'm not doing it alone." "You'll never be alone again," Sutton said. He kissed her then, on the porch with the fields behind them and the children beside them. Her hands curled into his shirt, and his arms went around her like that was where they'd always been meant to rest. That evening, they gathered around the hearth. Zadie braided dandelions into Tallie's hair while Zeke traced shapes in the ash with a stick. Sutton carved a new handle for the seed spade. "You ever think you'd be here?" Tallie asked softly. Sutton didn't look up. "I didn't let myself." "And now," he set down the carving and met her gaze. "Now I think I want to build something so steady it can't be shaken." She reached for his hand. "Then let's start with vows." They married on a quiet June morning under a cottonwood tree near the creek. Zadie wore her mother's shawl and carried a basket of wildflowers. Zeke stood beside Sutton, holding the ring he'd carved from a coin in his pocket. The preacher from the fort rode out at dawn and stayed for biscuits and coffee before heading back. They didn't have a crowd. Didn't need one. Tallie wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Sutton never took his eyes off her. When he spoke his promise, he said it like a man who'd lost once and would never let go again. Afterward, they danced in the yard while Zeke played the fiddle he'd finally begun to learn. Zadie laughed, her braid flying behind her, and Tallie's head rested against Sutton's shoulder as they turned slow in the evening light. The ranch stayed theirs. The barley came in strong, and the fort renewed their trade. They added a second garden bed and built a chicken coop near the house. Sutton taught Zadie to ride alone, and Tallie taught Zeke to write his name. They didn't speak much of the past, not because it was gone, but because it had already done the work of shaping them. What mattered was the quiet mornings, the soft hum of a new life growing, and the way their hands found each other without needing to ask. Love here wasn't loud. It was built into the days. Into the fields, the laughter, the shared weight of work, and the warmth of another body beside you when the wind rose outside. And when the first snow fell that winter, they stood on the porch together, wrapped in a single quilt, watching the world turn white. Tallie leaned into him, her voice soft. "It's all ours now." Sutton kissed her temple. "Always was, we just had to find it."